I caught my spoiled sister kissing my boyfriend just 1 week before her wedding. When I told her fiancé, I thought he brushed it off, but what he did at the wedding shocked everyone. As a 27-year-old woman, I never imagined I'd face such a complicated and painful situation involving my 25-year-old sister and my 28-year-old boyfriend. It all started as my sister's wedding date was fast approaching. I began noticing that her behavior around my boyfriend was odd. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking I was imagining things. But as time went on, her actions became harder to ignore. At the beginning, it wasn't anything too obvious, just small, subtle things that made me uncomfortable. For example, she'd laugh a little too hard at his jokes, even the ones that weren't funny at all. A simple, haha, that's funny, turned into loud, dramatic giggles that didn't match the situation. It was awkward, but I convinced myself that maybe she was just excited because her wedding was coming up. But her behavior didn't stop there. It got worse. She started finding reasons to touch him casually. She'd place her hand on his arm while talking, bump into him lightly as she walked by, or lean in too closely during conversations. These gestures might have seemed innocent to an outsider, but to me, they felt deliberate. I also noticed how her eyes lingered on him when he wasn't looking. She'd stare at him a bit too long, and it made my stomach twist with unease. One night, after we got home from a family dinner where my sister had been especially flirty, I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I turned to my boyfriend and asked, "Did you notice how Emily was acting tonight?" He looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. I explained what I had been seeing, the excessive laughing, the unnecessary touching, and the way her eyes always seemed to follow him. I was hoping he'd agree with me, but instead, he just shrugged and said, "You're overthinking it. She's probably just excited about the wedding. It's harmless." I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. No matter how much I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, my instincts told me otherwise. Over the next few weeks, I became more aware of everything. Every time we were around my sister, I found myself on high alert, watching her every move. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. She always tried to sit next to my boyfriend or position herself near him. She found endless excuses to ask for his help with wedding tasks, even when I was standing right there, and I could have helped her myself. One afternoon, we were at my parents' house for a family barbecue. I excused myself to use the bathroom, and when I came back, I saw something that made my heart drop. My sister and my boyfriend were standing in the corner of the yard, talking quietly. They were standing far too close for comfort, and she was giggling at something he said. Her laugh echoed in my head, making me feel sick. As soon as they noticed me, they quickly stepped apart. My sister walked away as if nothing had happened, leaving me frozen in place. I didn't want to make a scene in front of everyone, so I kept quiet and waited until we got home. Later that night, when we were alone, I asked my boyfriend about it. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked, "What were you and Emily talking about earlier?" He seemed surprised by my question. "Oh, we were just talking about the wedding," he replied casually. She was asking my opinion on the music. Something about his answer didn't sit right with me. "Why did you need to stand so close to talk about that?" I pressed. He sighed, clearly frustrated. "You're reading too much into this," he said. "She's just being friendly. There's nothing going on." But his words didn't comfort me. By this point, my suspicions were impossible to ignore, and I felt like I was drowning in doubt. My gut was telling me that something was wrong, but I had no proof yet. The tension only grew as the wedding day approached. Then, everything came crashing down in the most shocking way imaginable. I couldn't keep my feelings bottled up anymore. The frustration I had been suppressing came rushing out. I told my boyfriend how I felt, pointing out that my sister was practically throwing herself at him and that he wasn't doing anything to stop it. My words seemed to hit him hard. He looked at me with a hurt expression and asked, "What do you want me to do?" "She's your sister." "I'm just trying to be polite." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Polite?" I asked, feeling my anger rising. "You could at least set some boundaries. Make it clear that you're not interested in anything beyond being friendly." But he shook his head and insisted, "I'm not interested in her at all. There's nothing to clarify because there's nothing going on. You're seeing problems that aren't there. The conversation went around in circles. I tried to make him understand how obvious her behavior was, but he kept brushing it off. Neither of us could see the other's perspective, and our frustration only grew. Eventually, we both gave up. With no resolution, we went to bed, still angry and upset. The next morning, I realized something needed to change. Talking to my boyfriend hadn't worked, so I decided it was time to confront my sister directly. Avoiding the problem was only making things worse. I picked up the phone, called her, and asked if we could meet for coffee. She agreed right away, her voice cheerful and light. It seemed like she had no idea about the storm brewing inside me. We planned to meet at a small cafe near her apartment. When we finally sat down, I was a mess of nerves. My hands shook slightly as I stirred my coffee, trying to figure out how to start the conversation. My sister, on the other hand, was in a great mood. She was bubbling with excitement as she talked about her wedding plans, completely oblivious to the tension I was feeling. After a few minutes of listening to her chat, I couldn't take it anymore. I interrupted her mid-sentence, my voice serious and firm. "Emily, we need to talk about something important," I said. She froze, caught off guard by my sudden change in tone. Her cheerful expression shifted to one of surprise. "What's wrong?" she asked. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I need to talk to you about how you've been acting around Michael," I began. "It's been making me really uncomfortable." Her face changed as she processed my words. First, she looked surprised, then confused, and finally, angry. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "I haven't been acting any kind of way around Michael." I held my ground, refusing to back down. "Yes, you have," I said firmly. "Whether you realize it or not, you've been flirting with him. The touching, the constant laughing at his jokes, even when they aren't funny, and the way you're always finding reasons to be near him. It's not okay, and it needs to stop." Her reaction wasn't what I expected. Instead of apologizing or even considering my feelings, she laughed, a cold, dismissive laugh. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "Michael is practically family. I'm just being friendly." Her words only made me feel worse. I could tell she was angry, but I was just as upset. "This isn't just being friendly, Emily," I replied, my voice rising slightly. "It's more than that. You've crossed the line, and it's making me uncomfortable. You're my sister, and I love you, but you can't act this way around my boyfriend." Her face turned red with anger, and her disbelief was clear. "I can't believe you're accusing me of this," she said sharply. "Do you think I'd try to steal your boyfriend? That's insane." I shook my head. "I don't know what to think anymore," I admitted. "All I know is what I've seen and how it's made me feel." The tension between us was thick, and I could tell this conversation wasn't going to end well. It felt like a wall had been built between us, one that would be hard to tear down. As we sat there, staring at each other in silence, I realized that things between us might never go back to the way they were. But despite how painful it was, I knew I had done the right thing by speaking up. My sister was completely shocked by my accusations, especially since her wedding was just around the corner. Her reaction wasn't one of understanding or remorse. Instead, she fired back with sharp words. She questioned my confidence and even suggested that I must be deeply insecure to think she was behaving inappropriately. Her words hit me hard, but I refused to back down. "I'm not doing this because of insecurity," I told her firmly. "This is about respect. You're crossing a line, and it needs to stop." But she wasn't having any of it. Suddenly, she stood up, the legs of her chair scraping loudly against the floor. It was her way of signaling that the conversation was over. She glared at me and said, "I'm not going to sit here and listen to these paranoid and ridiculous accusations. If you can't trust your own sister, that's your problem, not mine." Before I could respond, she stormed out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there alone. I felt a rush of emotions, anger, sadness, regret, and confusion. I started questioning myself. Had I overreacted? Was I just being paranoid? When I got home, my boyfriend noticed immediately that something was wrong. He asked me what had happened, and I explained everything, the confrontation, her reaction, and how she had stormed out. As I spoke, I could see concern growing on his face. When I finished, he let out a deep sigh and said, "I think you might have made a big mistake." His words stung, and I felt defensive. "What do you mean? Are you taking her side?" He quickly shook his head. "I'm not taking sides," he said. "But I just don't think Emily was flirting with me. And even if she was, I don't think confronting her like that was the best way to handle it." Hearing this only made me feel worse. "So, what was I supposed to do? Just ignore it?" I asked, my voice cracking as tears began to well up in my eyes. Seeing how upset I was, my boyfriend walked over and wrapped his arms around me in a gentle hug. "I'm not saying you should have ignored it," he said softly. "But maybe we could have talked about it more. Maybe you could have approached her in a way that wasn't so direct. Now she's upset, and with the wedding coming up, this is just going to make things harder for everyone." His words made me feel even more conflicted. I pulled away from his embrace, staring at him with hurt and frustration. "So, this is my fault. I degraced. You think I'm to blame for all of this?" He sighed heavily, struggling to find the right words. "I'm not saying it's all your fault," he replied carefully. "But maybe you let your emotions take over. I think you might have overreacted a little." That was the last thing I wanted to hear. We ended up arguing again, going back and forth without really resolving anything. It was clear that we saw the situation from completely different perspectives, and neither of us was willing to fully understand the other's point of view. Eventually, he decided to go to bed, leaving me alone with my swirling thoughts and doubts. The days that followed were tense and painful. My sister completely stopped speaking to me, and the silence between us felt heavier with each passing day. My parents noticed something was wrong and called me, asking why Emily seemed so upset. I tried to explain the situation to them, but I could tell from their tone that they thought I was overreacting. As the wedding day grew closer, I felt more and more uncertain about what to do. I was supposed to be one of Emily's bridesmaids, a role that now felt like a heavy weight instead of an honor. I didn't even know if Emily still wanted me to stand beside her on her big day. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was still invited to the wedding. He suggested that we both go to show there were no hard feelings, but the idea made me feel sick. The thought of watching my sister walk down the aisle, knowing how hurt and angry she was, filled me with dread. I tried reaching out to Emily several times, hoping to patch things up. I called her again and again, but she never answered. Each time her voice Graciel picked up, the silence afterward felt like a wall between us, growing taller and harder to break through. The entire situation had become an overwhelming mess, and I had no idea how to fix it. It felt like no matter what I did, someone would end up hurt. And as much as I hated to admit it, I started wondering if my boyfriend and my parents were right. Had I made things worse by confronting her? Or was I justified in standing up for myself? The weight of uncertainty pressed down on me, and the closer the wedding day got, the heavier it became. After my confrontation with Emily, things only got worse. I left Voic Graysiles for her, apologizing and saying that we needed to talk things through. I even went to her apartment to try to mend things, but when she opened the door and saw me, she immediately shut it in my face. As the wedding day got closer, my anxiety grew. I felt trapped, unsure of how to move forward. My boyfriend, Michael, kept telling me to let it go and reassured me that everything would eventually blow over. But I wasn't so sure. The tension was unbearable, and it even started invading my dreams. One night, I dreamed that I showed up at the wedding, and as soon as I walked in, everyone turned to stare at me. They pointed, whispered, and murmured, making me feel like an outcast. I woke up trembling, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Things took a turn for the worse when Emily told our mom about my accusations. My mom called me, furious and shouting at the top of her lungs. "How could you do this right before Emily's wedding?" she yelled. "How could you accuse your own sister of something like this?" I tried to explain my perspective, but she wouldn't listen. She insisted that I was being selfish and unreasonable, degrading that I fix the situation immediately and apologize to Emily. Her words left me feeling like the villain in all of this. My family was falling apart, and I was at the center of it. Meanwhile, Emily refused to talk to me, and my parents were clearly on her side. Michael continued to insist I was overreacting, which only made me feel more depressed and angry. It felt like I was completely alone in this, with no one to back me up. 1 week before the wedding, I decided to visit my parents' house to try to smooth things over. I thought maybe I could explain myself better in person and make them understand my side of the story. But as I walked up to the house, I heard voices coming from the garden. Curious, I wandered over to see who was there.
What I saw stopped me in my tracks.
There, partially hidden behind a large plant, were Emily and Michael. They were locked in a passionate embrace. Emily's legs were wrapped around Michael's waist, and his hand was beneath her shirt. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't even notice me standing there. For a moment, I couldn't move. It felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. My heart pounded in my chest as a wave of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak surged through me. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "What the hell is this?" I screamed, my voice trembling with rage and pain. They froze immediately, their heads snapping toward me. The looks on their faces, shock, guilt, and panic, told me everything I needed to know. Emily's face turned pale as she realized she had been caught, while Michael stammered, "It's not what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. Every suspicion, every fear I had, was now confirmed. Tears streamed down my face as I choked out, "How could you? My own sister? My boyfriend?" My voice cracked with the weight of my pain. Emily started crying, her voice shaking as she tried to apologize. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "We didn't mean for this to happen." But I couldn't bear to listen to her excuses. The betrayal was too deep, too raw. Without another word, I turned and ran, ignoring their desperate pleas for me to come back. I got into my car and drove away, tears blurring my vision. My phone started ringing almost immediately. First it was Michael, then Emily, then my mom. But I couldn't bring myself to answer any of their calls. The pain was too overwhelming, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. When I got home, I felt numb. I couldn't stay there, surrounded by reminders of what had just happened. I grabbed a bag and packed a few clothes and essentials, not really sure where I was going. Before I left, I sent Michael a single text. "We're done. Don't contact me again." Then I turned off my phone and left. Now, I'm sitting in a small hotel room in a nearby city, trying to figure out what to do next. The wedding is just a few days away, but there's no way I can attend. My relationship is over, and the bond one once shared with my sister feels shattered beyond repair. Everyone made me feel like I was crazy for suspecting something was wrong. They all told me I was overreacting, paranoid, or insecure. But in the end, I was right. I saw the truth with my own eyes, and that realization hurts more than I can put into words. Now I'm left questioning everything. How did it come to this? Could I have done something differently? And how do I move forward when everything I thought I could rely on has fallen apart? After discovering my sister Emily with my now ex-boyfriend Michael, I was left shattered. The days that followed felt like a blur. I couldn't think straight, and my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. There were countless missed calls and messages from Emily, Michael, and even my parents, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. I felt completely overwhelmed by the betrayal and heartbreak. But as I sat with my emotions, one thought kept coming back to me. Andrew, Emily's fiancé, deserved to know the truth. No matter how hard it would be to tell him, I couldn't keep this from him. With a heavy heart, I decided to call him. When Andrew picked up, his voice was calm but confused. "What's going on?" he asked. "Emily's been in a terrible state. She said you've disappeared and won't talk to anyone." I took a deep breath and started explaining everything. I told him about the suspicions I had at first, how I had been dismissed by both Emily and Michael, and how everyone made me feel like I was imagining things. Then, I described the scene I had witnessed in my parents' garden, how I had caught them together in an intimate embrace. Andrew stayed silent throughout, only making small sounds to let me know he was still listening. When I finally finished, there was a long pause. Then, in a steady voice, he said, "Thank you for telling me. I need time to process this." And with that, he hung up. I stared at my phone, unsure of what he would do next. As the wedding day approached, I didn't hear anything from Andrew or my family. Emily had stopped trying to contact me, and I started to wonder if she had somehow convinced Andrew to forgive her. The idea that she might get away with everything, that she might still have her perfect wedding day while my life was in pieces, made me feel sick. There was no way I could attend the wedding. The thought of watching Emily walk down the aisle, knowing what she had done, was unbearable. Instead, I decided to spend that day alone, focusing on how I could rebuild my life. Then, on the evening of the wedding, I got a surprising call from my cousin Grace. Her voice was low and urgent, but I could hear the excitement bubbling under the surface. "Oh my God," she whispered. "You won't believe what just happened." Confused and intrigued, I asked, "What? What happened?" Grace wasted no time diving into the story. She told me that everything seemed normal at first. Emily had looked beautiful in her wedding dress, and Andrew was standing at the altar, waiting for the ceremony to begin. But when it came time for the vows, Andrew suddenly stepped forward and said he had something to share. My heart started racing as Grace described the scene. Andrew turned to the guests and announced, "I can't go through with this wedding. I can't marry someone who betrayed her own sister and destroyed her life by getting involved with her boyfriend." Grace said the entire room fell silent, everyone too shocked to speak. Emily turned pale, completely blindsided by Andrew's words. Then, to everyone's disbelief, Andrew turned to my parents and apologized. "You deserve to know the truth," he said, "about why my name distanced herself from all of you." Emily burst into tears, trying to explain, but Andrew didn't give her a chance. He walked out of the church, leaving her standing alone at the altar. The guests were left whispering in confusion, while my parents sat stunned, trying to process what had just happened. "It was like something out of a movie," Grace said, her voice still filled with disbelief. "Everyone's in shock. Your parents are trying to get the full story from Emily, but she's a wreck." As I listened to Grace's account, a flood of emotions washed over me. On one hand, I felt a sense of vindication. The truth had finally come out, and everyone now knew what Emily and Michael had done. But on the other hand, I felt a deep sadness. This wasn't how I wanted things to end. The pain and chaos that had consumed my family weren't what I had hoped for, even after such a betrayal. "Are you okay?" Grace asked gently. I'm not sure," I admitted. "I never wanted it to end like this." After we talked a little more, I hung up and sat quietly, trying to sort through my thoughts. Yes, the truth was out, but it had come at a huge cost. My relationship with Michael was over. My bond with Emily was broken, possibly forever. And now my family was in crisis. Still, I felt a small sense of relief for the first time in weeks. At least now I could begin to move forward. The weight of holding everything in, of being dismissed and doubted, was finally gone. Moving on won't be easy. Trusting anyone again feels like an impossible task, and I know I'll have to face my family at some point. But for now, I'm taking things one day at a time. If I've learned anything from this experience, it's the importance of trusting my instincts. Even when everyone doubted me, even when I started to doubt myself, I was right to follow my gut. To anyone else in a similar situation, my advice is this: trust yourself. Don't let anyone convince you to ignore what you know in your heart to be true. Thank you for listening to my story. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell for more real-life stories like this.